wanted to talk about a friend of mine and yet another friend of mine, and then kind of talk about their journey and how they overcame some limits, and see if we can find ways for you to be able to apply those in your lives. So I'm going to talk about my friend Jerry for today. Jerry, much like I did, grew up in the shadow of aviation and more than anything, wanted to fly for a living. And he was the kind of kid that would go out to the airport and literally sweep flight lines to be able to get a couple nickels together. And every time he had $10 or $20 in his pocket, he was running to the instructor to be able to get his flight lesson in. And he was able to grow this passion into an undergraduate in aerospace engineering that he did at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And at the same time, he paralleled that effort through the Air Force ROTC program. So here's a guy who's always wanted to fly, has gotten into a pretty good aeronautical engineering program, and is in a pretty good ROTC program, right? And so he's excited because he's going through the paces of learning how to fly and learning then how to teach and getting to fly more and more complex aircraft. When he finally graduates, he gets a plum assignment in the Air Force as an instructor pilot. So he started off in the T-37. It's a aircraft that was made by Cessna Aircraft called the Tweet. And then he became an instructor pilot flying in the T-38. The T-37, not a very complex aircraft. The T-38 is an aircraft that's out to kill you. But he had this great opportunity afforded him by persevering and staying with the ability to educate himself and get into the Air Force ROTC program, put on the uniform, and move forward. And it was all punishment that he was levying on himself exclusively because he knew that if he did this, it was in his career path, he would get to fly this. One of the coolest planes ever made, the F-15C. Now, if you're not familiar with this aircraft, this is one that it has a little better than a 2-to-1 thrust-to-weight ratio, which means that you can stand on its tail coming off the runway, advance to military power, and continue to climb. So this was his goal, was to get into an Eagle and drive it. He got out of the IP job, went down to Eglin Air Force Base, was excited because he was in processing. He was going to get to join the squadron and get to fly his dream machine. Went up to the flight surgeon, went through his physical, and the flight surgeon stepped out of the room, came back and said, "Jerry, there's two things I need to tell you today. The first one is you were a pilot. The second one is you are a diabetic." And that immediately ended his Air Force career. So I wouldn't have faulted Jerry for taking a pretty dark course in his life. Now, here's a guy whose only passion was to fly and wanted to be able to exercise this particular piece of military hardware through the skies. Jerry instead took a little different course. He went to a company called Link, which made flight simulators, and he helped them improve the artificial intelligence in the flight simulators to increase the fidelity of the training environment of other pilots that were going to be going into harsh environments. So he was able to apply what he was doing in his life all the way up to that point. Even though he wasn't going to be in the cockpit, he was going to be able to make an improvement in everybody else's life. Now we come to about 2000, when I met Jerry. And over one night of sitting around and consuming some adult beverages, he told me this story of his trip to through the Air Force. And he said how much he missed flying. And I said, "Jerry, the only limitation to you not flying is you." And he looked at me kind of stunned. And I said, "Did you know that the FAA has put together a program for diabetics to be able to fly?" And he was stunned to find this. And I said, "Well, let me tell you the story of Doug Cairns." Douglas Cairns was a Royal Air Force pilot, was a fighter pilot in the Royal Air Force, had the exact same experience. One day went in, found out he had become a diabetic. Doug is so passionate about flying that he came to the United States and became a citizen because our country afforded him the freedom to be able to exercise the privilege of flying by issuing him a third-class medical. He took that challenge on and kind of expanded on it because he's nuts. But Douglas decided he was going to do two things to prove that diabetes doesn't have to stop your life. The first one is he got into a Beechcraft Baron and he flew it around the world by himself and did it in a record time. And he did it to kind of demonstrate that diabetes doesn't have to be something that limits you. And it wasn't enough for him to do that. He followed that up by flying from Barrow, Alaska to the North Pole by himself in a single engine plane, landing it, taking a photo, a selfie, and then coming back. So I talked to Jerry about Douglas, and I put him in touch. By the way, Douglas Cairns lives up in Boulder now, so he's a Coloradan just like us. And I started to get Jerry to start thinking about what are the things that you've been self-imposing that are holding you back in your life because of this perception that diabetes has stopped your ability to fly, when if you will open the horizon a little bit, open the aperture and take a look, everybody has made a path for you to enable that, to be able to go back into that. So much like most of my friends do, he didn't put his toe into the water, he bought a 310. So now Jerry is going bankrupt just like I am, flying his 310, burning up as much gas as he possibly can, as often as he can, exercising the privilege that's afforded him by being a pilot in the United States. So thinking about those particular unique circumstances with Jerry and with Douglas Cairns, I started to reflect on, well, what are the other things we see in our lives but we don't really see because we don't have the same lens by which we view things. So I was thinking about the other people that we see on a daily basis that have maybe limitations, whether they were birth limitations, like Jessica Cox. Jessica was born without arms, but she had such a passion for aviation that she convinced the FAA to let her take the practical exam to fly a light sport aircraft that she can fly with her feet. And if you don't know Jessica's story, she has her pilot's license. And she has an air coupe, and she is burning up Arizona probably today, flying around in that. Another one to think about is Amy Van Dyken. She's been in the news only recently, right? Here's an Olympic medalist, somebody that has a very storied career, and yet she was on TV just last night. Thankfully, she's alive, right? She had an ATV accident and severed her spine, and she's never going to swim, in the Olympics again. But I'll bet you a donut that she swims in the Paralympics. This is somebody that can find a way to overcome that limitation. Gabby Giffords, I ran into her and her husband Mark in the airport in San Francisco a couple weeks ago. I had the chance to talk to them again. Here's somebody that's overcome great adversity, great limitations. Was that something that was on her path from birth? Absolutely not. But she's finding ways to overcome that challenge and move forward in life. Peter Dinklage. This is the most unlikely Hollywood hero. He is huge on HBO's Game of Thrones. He's a leading man, and yet not what we would normally classify for a Hollywood heartthrob or a Hollywood star. And then, of course, Christopher Reeve. Here's a guy that was infinitely famous in the opposite side of that spectrum for Hollywood, and then just went out for a horse ride one day, and everything was changed in his life. So I challenge you to think about what you perceive as limitations in your life and find the ways to overcome those, maybe by opening the aperture a little bit. Thank you.